Some secrets aren't buried because they are dangerous, but because those who uncover them rarely live to tell the tale. Yet, no secret stays buried forever. Sooner or later, the earth grows restless, and when the truth rises, it doesn't just reveal itself, it changes everything. That night, as the rain washed the streets clean, it wasn't just the dirt that was being erased, but the last remnants of a truth that had been waiting in the shadows for far too long. And now, that truth was ready to be heard, no matter the cost. The bus lurched to a halt on Hazelmere's High Street, its brakes hissing like a whispered warning through the unsettling stillness. The village lay under a pale afternoon sun, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence left behind when a conversation is cut short, leaving secrets hanging in the air. Miss Eleanor Graves stepped down, her gaze sweeping the surroundings, taking in more than she let on. The driver leaned out, tossing down her well-worn suitcase. "Here you go, miss." Visiting family, Eleanor adjusted her gloves with a small smile. "An old acquaintance," she replied, her tone as measured as her steps. She traveled light, a handbag, a neatly folded shawl, and an unshakable certainty that the truth was rarely as simple as people pretended. From the opposite end of the cobbled street, Margaret Henshaw approached, her expression unreadable, but her pace quick. "Eleanor, thank goodness," she said, her voice holding the kind of relief that carried unspoken urgency. Eleanor allowed the embrace, brief but polite. "You made good time." "The bus was punctual," she murmured, "the company less so." One man spent half the trip explaining why his brother-in-law ought to run for mayor. The other half, he snored. Margaret chuckled, linking arms with her, and steering her toward the village square. Politics and poor manners. A dreadful combination. The village looked picturesque. Ivy-clad cottages, the warm scent of fresh bread wafting from the bakery, but Eleanor knew better. Behind every lace-curtained window, someone was watching, listening, hiding something. "I appreciate you coming," Margaret said, voice dipping. "I know it was short notice, but I thought you'd want to be here. The trial begins tomorrow." Eleanor's expression remained unreadable, though a flicker of something sharpened her gaze. "Trial? A rather unpleasant affair," Margaret hesitated, lowering her voice. "It involves Edmund Blackwood." The name dropped like a coin into a silent room. Eleanor didn't react outwardly, but Margaret saw the way her grip tightened just slightly on her handbag. Everyone had heard of Blackwood. He had a talent for unearthing the very things people fought to keep buried, and a habit of turning those secrets into currency. "He's been blackmailing Arthur Drummond, the bank clerk. Poor man's on trial for embezzlement, but it's complicated." Eleanor let the silence stretch. Complicated how? Margaret's glance flicked toward the looming courthouse at the street's end. Hazelmere Courthouse, its grey stone facade swallowing the light. "They say Blackwood has half the courtroom in his pocket. The judge, the prosecutor, maybe more." Eleanor turned toward the courthouse, studying it as if weighing something unseen. The stillness of the village settled around them again, but this time, it carried an edge, a fracture beneath the surface. The coffee house sat on the square's edge, where the scent of ground beans clashed with the stale air of old conversations. Inside, voices dipped at their arrival, as if hesitant to be overheard. They took a table near the window, where they could observe without being the observed. Margaret leaned in. "You can feel it, can't you? The whole village holding its breath." Eleanor stirred her tea, watching a group of men hunched in the corner. Their suits suggested they belonged in a courtroom. Their hushed conversation suggested otherwise. "It's a damn mess," muttered one, a portly man with fingers drumming the table. "Blackwood's got enough dirt to bury half that courthouse." "More than half," his thinner companion murmured, smoothing his slicked back hair. "Drummond just got caught." "Or desperate," the portly man scoffed. "And then there's Farley." The name froze Eleanor's teacup mid-air. Solomon Farley, the judge. Margaret caught her reaction. Blackwood never cared who he leaned on, she whispered. Only what they had to lose. Eleanor nodded, thoughtful. And has anyone ever bested him? Margaret hesitated. Not that I've heard, she admitted. But that doesn't mean they didn't try. The bus groaned to a stop on Hazelwick's cobbled high street, its brakes hissing like a reluctant admission. The village lay under a muted afternoon sky, too still, too watchful, the kind of silence that felt like an unfinished conversation, paused, not ended. Miss Evelyn Harrow stepped down, her sharp gaze sweeping the street, missing nothing, yet revealing even less. The driver hauled down her suitcase with a grunt. Here y'are, miss. Visiting family. Evelyn's gloved fingers adjusted the strap of her handbag. An old friend, she replied, her voice even. She traveled light, just a neatly folded shawl for the evening chill, a leather-bound notebook, and an unwavering belief that people rarely confessed their truths willingly. From across the square, Margaret Lorne approached, her stride brisk, her eyes darting. Evelyn, she exhaled, relief laced with something heavier. You came. Evelyn accepted the brief embrace, polite but unyielding. The trial is tomorrow, Margaret continued, lowering her voice, and the whole village is waiting for the hammer to fall. Evelyn followed her through the winding streets, noting the furtive glances, the way people moved, quick steps, heads ducked, as if afraid the shadows themselves might listen. Hazelwick wore the look of a place bracing for a storm. The courthouse loomed ahead, its grey stone facade bearing the weight of judgment. The judge looks half dead from exhaustion, Margaret murmured, and Holbrook, the prosecutor, well, if you saw him in a sick room, you'd start making funeral arrangements. Evelyn's gaze swept over the heavy oak doors, the chipped steps leading up to them. The weight of justice can be a burden, she remarked. Margaret scoffed. It's not justice troubling them, it's Montgomery Blackwood. The name landed like a stone in still water. Blackwood, Hazelwick's self-appointed puppeteer, a man whose talent for unearthing secrets had left a trail of ruined reputations and quiet tragedies. Finley's always been steady, Margaret continued, voice tight, but these past weeks, jumpy, short-tempered, snapped at his clerk so hard last Tuesday, the boy nearly swallowed his pen. And Holbrook, she hesitated. I overheard him saying he wished this whole business would just disappear. Evelyn absorbed that in silence. A prosecutor wasn't meant to dread a case he was set to win. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter. Blackwood was meant to testify tomorrow. If he has dirt on Finley, on Holbrook, we'll soon know. Evelyn glanced at the courthouse doors, then at the village beyond, at the tension stretched tight, the breath held, the sense of something shifting beneath the surface. She tapped a gloved finger against her handbag. Perhaps I ought to attend, she said lightly. It's been some time since I've seen a performance worth the price of admission. Margaret sighed. I don't think this one ends well, dear. Evelyn only smiled, a glint in her eye that suggested she had already decided something wasn't right. That night the courthouse loomed in the fog, heavy with the weight of whispered secrets. Inside, the scent of ink and unease clung to the air. Clerks shuffled papers, barristers muttered over case files. Evelyn moved through the hall, unremarkable but observant, catching every hurried glance, every clenched jaw. This was the hush before the thunder. Harriet Whitmore paced near the defense bench, her tailored suit crisp but her face betraying sleepless nights. Her shoes clicked sharp against the marble. Evelyn settled into a seat near the aisle. You'll wear out the floor at that rate. Harriet stopped but did not smile. It's already worn out. So is my client. Evelyn followed her gaze to Edgar Dunn, the accused. He sat hunched, hands twisting a handkerchief into knots, his pressed suit betraying signs of restless sleep. His gaze flickered too often toward the doors, waiting for something or someone. Evelyn took the empty seat beside him. You're not a man built for crime, Mr. Dunn. His head jerked up. I didn't, he swallowed. I didn't mean to. Evelyn nodded as if that made sense. Blackwood had something on you, a breath left done long and frayed. It wasn't much discrepancies in the ledgers. Small errors, things I meant to fix. But Blackwood, he hesitated, glancing at the door again. He made them sound worse, said he'd testify, said he'd make sure I went to prison, and you believed him. Dunn gave a hollow laugh. Why wouldn't I? He had everyone else dancing to his tune. Evelyn's gaze flicked to the prosecution table where Holbrook sat, fingers tapping against his desk, jaw tight. At the judge's bench, Finley massaged his temples, the weight of something unseen pressed against the room. The trial had not yet begun, but already Evelyn could tell justice was the least of what was at stake. The courthouse had always carried the scent of dust and quiet tension, but tonight something else lingered, a sharp metallic note beneath the usual mustiness. Eleanor Graves, seated near the far end of the hall, stirred her tea with deliberate ease, though her eyes never left the heavy oak doors of the judge's chambers. Simon Everley was late, but so too was Vincent Harlow. The room thrived on order, its very air pressed and measured, but the delay sent ripples of unease through the gathered crowd. Lawyers muttered over briefs, clerks exchanged wary glances, and the hands of the grand clock edged forward with unsettling patience. Then came the sound that shattered the courthouse's fragile calm, a voice, raw and desperate, cutting through the hum of whispered conversations. "Help! Someone please, help!" The cry belonged to a junior clerk, his face ashen, his breath ragged as he stumbled into the corridor. For a long second, no one moved. Then the air crackled with sudden movement, shoes striking marble, chairs scraping back, hushed voices rising into alarm. Eleanor did not rush, did not frown. She merely set her teacup down, the china clinking softly against the saucer, and rose. She reached the door before most had found their footing. The judge's chambers lay at the end of the hall, past polished wooden panels and brass nameplates that gleamed under the gaslights. The clerk stood just outside, trembling, his hands clenched into fists. "It's him," he choked out, "Harlow. He's—" Eleanor stepped past him. Inside, Vincent Harlow was slumped over the arm of a high-backed chair, frozen mid-motion, as if interrupted mid-thought. His suit remained impeccable, his silk tie precisely knotted, and beside him on the desk, a crystal glass of whiskey sat undisturbed. But the rest of him told another story. His complexion had taken on the pallor of candle wax, his lips tinged with an unnatural blue, his mouth half parted, bore an expression caught between a grimace and a final unfinished word. His fingers had curled inward, stiff and rigid, grasping at something that never came. A sharp inhale behind Eleanor, someone, perhaps a barrister or clerk, trying and failing to contain their horror. Then the chaos came. People pushed into the room, voices tumbling over one another, questions flying without answers. Eleanor did not add to the noise. Instead, she observed. The papers on Harlow's desk were stacked in perfect order. His coat, still draped over the rack, bore no sign of haste. And in the air, beneath the usual scents of ink and paper, lingered something bitter, something wrong. "Is he?" The voice, breathless and edged with dread, belonged to Margaret Dean. Eleanor turned. "Yes," she said simply. A new voice cut through the din, crisp and commanding. "Step back, all of you." Dr. Oliver Finch strode in, his expression composed, his movements practiced. He moved to the body with the familiarity of a man accustomed to delivering bad news. His fingers methodical as he checked for a pulse he already knew he would not find. He lifted an eyelid, frowned, then straightened. "Dead," he confirmed, "at least an hour." The murmurs shifted, heads turning toward one another in quiet alarm. Eleanor glanced at the clock. "Which means," she said, her voice clear, "he was dead before the trial was meant to begin." Silence settled over the room, then a sound, the door swinging open, and in the threshold stood Simon Everley. He carried his authority like a heavy cloak, his presence drawing every eye in the room. But Eleanor's gaze was fixed on his expression, on the brief flicker of something in his eyes as he took in the scene. Not shock, no, he was too careful for that. It was calculation, a moment's hesitation, a fraction too long, and in that pause Eleanor knew. Vincent Harlow had been silenced, and not a single person in the room looked surprised. The courthouse, steeped in the scent of old paper and quiet deliberation, had turned into something else entirely, a place where the air was thick, charged with an unspoken weight. Clara Whitmore, seated near the corridor's farthest bench, tapped her gloved fingers against her knee, her gaze steady on the judge's chambers. Samuel Groves was late, but so too was Frederick Langley. The courthouse functioned on precision, on order, yet the growing hush that settled over the crowd spoke of something unraveling beneath the surface. A lawyer cleared his throat too loudly, a clerk shuffled papers with restless fingers, then the stillness cracked, a voice raw and unsteady burst into the hallway. "Help! Someone, please!" The young clerk stumbled forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his complexion ashen. For a moment no one moved. Then, like a stone dropped into deep water, the room rippled to life. Chairs scraped back, hurried footsteps struck the floor, and murmurs bled into something dangerously close to panic. Clara did not move with the rush. She merely set down her porcelain teacup on the arm of her chair, the faint clink lost beneath the rising noise, and stood. By the time most had found their footing, she was already at the door. The judge's chambers lay at the end of the hall, past doors bearing brass plaques, past solemn wood paneling that had seen years of quiet negotiations and weighted decisions. The clerk stood just outside, trembling, his lips parted, but his voice lost. "It's him," he finally choked out. "Langley." "He's..." Clara stepped past him. Inside, Frederick Langley sat slumped over his desk, his body unnaturally still, his hand curled against the polished mahogany, as though reaching for something just out of grasp. His suit remained impeccable, his tie a perfect Windsor knot, and beside him, a cut crystal glass of brandy sat untouched. But his face told the truth of it. His pallor had turned waxy, his lips tinged with an eerie blue, his mouth hung open in a silent, unfinished word, his fingers, stiff and claw-like, betrayed the violence of whatever had gripped him in those final moments. A sharp inhale from behind Clara, someone registering the horror too late. Then the wave of noise, a flood of people, a cacophony of questions, voices rising like a storm battering against locked doors. Dead? How? Poison? Murder? The words sliced through the din, sharp and unforgiving. It came first from one voice, then another, and another, until it whispered through the hallway like a creeping tide. The crowd turned as one, their collective weight shifting, and their eyes settled on Edwin Harrow, the bank clerk, who stood rigid and pale beside the defense bench. His gaze fell upon the silk handkerchief near Langley's lifeless hand, navy blue, with initials embroidered in neat silver thread, E.H. His breath caught. His mouth opened, but no words emerged. The room tightened around him. Clara observed, unmoved, her sharp eyes cataloguing every flicker of unease. Somewhere deep within the courthouse's walls, beneath the polished veneer of law and order, the truth lay waiting, coiled, silent and patient. The door swung open once more. Inspector Alden Reed stepped inside, the weight of his authority settling over the room like an iron shroud. His gaze swept the scene, lingering just long enough on Langley's rigid form before shifting to the gathered faces. His uniform, though crisp, bore the wear of long nights and unfinished cases. He exhaled, slow and measured. "No one moves," he ordered, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "No one leaves." The judge, an older man with a stiff bearing, drew himself up, his robe pooling around his shoulders. "Inspector, this is a courthouse, not a crime scene." Reed's gaze did not waver. "Seems to me it's both." A beat of silence, then movement, small, uneasy. "Hargrove," Reed called, his eyes locking onto the prosecutor. "Where were you?" The younger man ran a hand through his hair, his fingers lingering at the nape of his neck. "In my office," he said, "preparing for the trial, same as everyone else." "And Harrow?" The bank clerk jolted, like a deer catching the glint of a hunter's rifle. "I was here, in the courtroom. I never left." "Never?" Harrow hesitated, maybe for a moment, just to step outside. "But I swear, I never went near the judge's chambers." Clara's gaze shifted to Eleanor Davenport, arms crossed, watching with an expression too carefully composed. "It's true," she said after a pause. "He was with me, most of the time." "Most," Reed repeated, making a note. "And you, Miss Davenport?" She lifted her chin, reviewing my notes. "I wasn't watching the clock." The room contracted, thick with the weight of silent assessments. No one looked at the body anymore, they looked at each other. Measuring, calculating, deciding who among them had more to lose. Clara, still and steady, watched as well. She saw the way Hargrove's fingers refused to stay still, the way Harrow swallowed hard, his throat tight with something unspoken, the way Eleanor Davenport's calm was too rehearsed. And she knew, Frederick Langley had not merely died, he had been silenced, and no one in the room looked surprised. The courthouse was settling into the kind of silence that did not belong in a place of law, a silence that felt weighted, as if something just beneath the surface was waiting to break. Eleanor Vance adjusted the pearl buttons on her gloves as she moved through the dimly lit corridor, past men who spoke in whispers and clerks who hurried with a nervous energy. The scent of ink and paper lingered, but beneath it was something sharper, fear. In a town where secrets held more weight than evidence, a man like Howard Langford was bound to make enemies. And now he was dead. A knock at the clerk's door brought her to a young man in a suit that didn't quite fit, his spectacles smudged from anxious fingers. He wasn't the sort to make trouble, but he had seen it unfold. Langford was dangerous, he admitted, his voice just above a whisper. He didn't just know things, he documented them. Names, dates, deals that shouldn't have happened. He swallowed hard. And now that book, his hands trembled. If it's missing, someone's already using it. Eleanor left him pale and breathless, her mind already shaping the edges of something bigger. She found Harriet Gable in her office, framed by stacks of case files and the glow of a dying desk lamp. The defense attorney was composed, but her fingers tapped the edge of her cigarette case too precisely. "Langford was going to destroy my client," she said. "Not just in court. He made sure, if I didn't back down, the ruin would spread." Eleanor watched the way Harriet exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if calculating how much truth to offer. "I told him to leave my client alone." Her eyes flicked up, sharp. "I didn't threaten him. Depends on who was listening." Eleanor murmured. Silence stretched between them. Harriet leaned forward. "You think someone killed him because he knew too much, but what if someone killed him because they couldn't afford the truth to come out at all?" That was the question. And in a place like this, the answer was never simple. Langford had been a man worth killing. The real mystery was who had the most to lose. Inspector Hayes stood over Victor Holloway's lifeless body, his arms crossed, jaw tight, the usual sharpness in his eyes dulled by something heavier than fatigue. His coat bore the marks of a long night, creased, dusted with ash from too many cigarettes, and his hat had slipped back just enough to suggest he'd long stopped caring how he looked. "The doctor says cyanide," he muttered. "Fast, clean, no time to second guess." He glanced at Eleanor Vance, who adjusted the pearl buttons on her gloves, her expression unreadable. "Not much suffering then," she murmured. Hayes grunted. "Depends on how you define it. Holloway sat here long enough to know he wasn't getting back up." Eleanor's gaze flicked to the empty teacup beside the body, the faintest stain of something dark at the bottom. "Tea?" she asked. Hayes nodded. "Made in his office. Door locked from the inside. No struggle, no sign of a forced entry." Eleanor lifted the cup delicately. "No lipstick, no fingerprints. Clean." Too clean. Poison is patient, she murmured. It takes planning. It takes confidence. Hayes flipped open his notebook, tapping a pen against the page. Question is who poured the tea? His voice was rough, skeptical, but Eleanor already knew this wasn't just about the drink. It never was. Holloway had been meticulous, his desk arranged with the precision of a man who thrived on control, papers in crisp stacks, every drawer aligned perfectly. Yet, in the middle of it all, one thing stood out, a single silk handkerchief, dark green, embroidered with the initials R.G. Hayes scowled. Too easy, he muttered. Eleanor picked it up, running her fingers along the stitching. A man like Holloway didn't make careless friends, she said. And this is careless. Across the room, Robert Grayson stood rigid, hands clenched at his sides, his face paler than it should have been. I swear I don't know how it got there, he whispered. I own dozens, but this, Eleanor didn't let him finish. She pulled a tiny thread from the embroidery, then another, unraveling a hidden stitch. The R loosened, but the G remained firm. This wasn't always yours, Mr. Grayson, she said coolly. Hayes exhaled sharply. Someone planted it. Eleanor folded the handkerchief neatly, and they were in a hurry. Silence settled between them, thick with something unspoken. Hayes turned toward Holloway's still figure, his face frozen between pain and realization. Someone wanted Grayson to take the fall, he said. Eleanor's lips curled slightly. Not a smile, not yet. Or they wanted us to believe that, she corrected. There's a difference. Somewhere in this room, the real mistake had already been made, and Eleanor intended to find it. Inspector Hayes watched as Daniel Whitmore slumped into the chair, his face pale, fingers gripping the armrests like they were the only things keeping him upright. I don't know whether to be relieved or terrified, he muttered. Across the room, Eleanor Finch adjusted her gloves, her keen eyes never leaving Hayes as he scowled at the silk cravat laid out on the desk, an elegant piece of fabric embroidered with the initials, CL. It was too neat, too deliberate. Someone had gone to great lengths to frame Whitmore, which meant they were covering their own tracks. And if they had to go this far, it meant they had something to lose. Hayes sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. You know what this means, he muttered. Eleanor nodded, already turning over the thought in her mind. It means our murderer is more careful than we thought. That thought lingered with her as the courthouse emptied for the evening. Suspicion was moving faster than facts, whispered names traded in hushed tones, too many directions, too many possibilities. Eleanor moved through the dimly lit corridors until she reached the judge's chambers. She knocked once before stepping inside. Judge Alden Caro sat at his desk, his back straight, hands folded, but his eyes, the eyes of a man accustomed to control, were focused somewhere else, measuring, calculating. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Miss Finch, he said coolly, to what do I owe the pleasure? Eleanor took the seat opposite, adjusting her hat. No pleasure, I'm afraid. Just a word. Caro's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. I imagine that's an understatement. Eleanor didn't blink. People are talking. They always do. Yes, but this time, the whispers have names attached. Yours among them. Caro's fingers curled slightly. That's a dangerous accusation. No accusation, Eleanor said smoothly. Just curiosity. His jaw tightened, his fingers drumming once against the polished wood. Let's not waste time. You're here about Lawrence Whitmore. I am. He leaned back, the leather creaking beneath his weight. I had no dealings with the man beyond what was necessary. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. Oh? Caro exhaled sharply. Whatever rumors you've heard are just that, rumors. She let the silence stretch, watching him. Then calmly, she said, a man was hanged, Judge Caro. Something flickered in his expression, gone too fast to name. The Whitmore case. Years ago. A man sent to the gallows on your ruling. Caro's hands stilled. That's nonsense. Is it? His fingers curled into a fist. "The law is the law, Miss Finch. I followed it. But Lawrence Whitmore had something on you." A short, humorless laugh. "Whitmore had something on everyone. That doesn't mean I killed him." "No," Eleanor agreed. "But it does mean he had reason to fear you." Caro stood abruptly, walking to the corner cabinet. He poured himself a drink, the decanter landing on the table with a thud. Eleanor let her gaze drift across his desk. Papers neatly stacked, a brass letter opener, a glass of untouched water, and just off to the side, a small vial. She picked it up, turning it between her fingers. Interesting choice of decor. Caro turned, his gaze narrowing. "What's that? You tell me." His eyes flickered to the vial. A beat passed, then another. "I've never seen that before." Eleanor studied him. He sounded convincing. Too convincing. She set the vial down, nudging it slightly toward him. "I imagine Inspector Hayes will be interested." Caro's lips pressed together. "I suppose he will." Eleanor stood. "You don't strike me as a man who panics, Judge Caro. But if I didn't know better, I'd say you look cornered." His mouth twitched. This time, in irritation. "You don't know better." Eleanor's smile was barely there. "We'll see." She left without looking back. Caro was hiding something. That much was clear. But was it murder? That she wasn't sure of. Yet, outside the air was thick with unease. The courthouse steps had always been a place where men with heavy consciences paced, their murmured thoughts trailing behind them like ghosts. She watched from the shadows as Mr. Elliot Croft wore a path into the stone walkway, his polished shoes striking the ground harder than necessary, his lips moving in quick, unfinished sentences, the kind a man recites when he's trying to convince himself of something. His right hand clenched a small leather case, his fingers tapping against it like he wasn't sure whether to hold on or hurl it into the river. Eleanor adjusted her hat and stepped forward. "Bad time, Mr. Croft." His head snapped up, his grip tightened, his face was the color of ash. Perfect. He was already guilty of something, the only question was of what. Victor Langley stopped short, his face tightening for half a second before smoothing into practiced ease. "Miss Caldwell, you have an uncanny way of appearing just when a man needs a moment alone." His voice was light, but his grip on the leather folio in his hands was anything but. Eleanor Caldwell studied him with a faint smile. "A moment alone is rarely what a man truly needs," she mused, her gaze flicking toward the folio. Troubling case notes. Langley's grip subtly tightened. "Just private documents. Unrelated to anything that concerns you." Eleanor let out a soft laugh. "That's a relief. For a moment I thought you might be holding something connected to this morning's unfortunate events." Langley exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know what you're fishing for, Miss Caldwell, but you won't find it here." "Perhaps not," she allowed. "But I do wonder, where were you just before Mr. Blackwell's demise?" Langley's spine went rigid, his expression carefully neutral. "Are you accusing me of something?" Eleanor sighed, adjusting her gloves. "Dear me, everyone is so defensive today. I'm merely asking a question." Langley hesitated, then rolled his shoulders as if shedding an invisible weight. "I wasn't feeling well," he admitted. "Headache. Stepped out for air before the trial started. Came back just before the commotion." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "And in that time Blackwell was poisoned, in a locked room." Langley's face darkened. "A fact that has nothing to do with me." "Of course not," Eleanor said pleasantly, "though it is curious. Blackwell had quite a talent for making men nervous. And you, Mr. Langley, do seem nervous." Langley's fingers twitched around the folio. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to." Eleanor stepped aside with an easy nod, watching as he strode away, his grip still iron around that leather folio. A nervous man was one thing, a man with something to hide was another. Eleanor had long since learned that the most valuable information rarely came from grand statements made in court. The real truth belonged to those who saw without being seen. And so she found herself near the back of the dimly lit courthouse, speaking to Thomas Grayson, a man who had witnessed more secrets than the law itself. His face was weathered, his voice rough as stone against steel. "You're asking about Langley," he said, shifting a toothpick between his teeth. Eleanor nodded, just trying to piece together the morning's movements. Grayson scratched his chin. "Saw him by the judge's chambers, just before the body was found." She adjusted her hat. "How long before?" Grayson squinted. "Hard to say, 10 maybe 15 minutes. I was coming down the hall, saw him standing outside the door, looking like a man trying to make up his mind about something." "And did he go in?" Grayson chewed his toothpick. "Not while I was looking, but he sure wasn't there for the scenery." Eleanor thought of Langley's nervous pacing, the white-knuckle grip on that leather folio. "Did he see you?" Grayson snorted. "Oh, he saw me, all right. Gave a little start, pulled himself together quick, nodded at me like nothing was wrong. But something was." She let the words settle before asking, "And the judge?" Grayson's mouth curled into something close to a smirk. "Now that's where it gets interesting." Eleanor leaned in. "Go on." "Judge Redgrave's been saying he was on the bench the whole time." Grayson shook his head. "Not true." Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "How do you know?" Grayson tapped his temple. "Because I saw him step out, not long before Blackwell turned up dead." Eleanor let that turn over in her mind. "Did he see you?" Grayson gave a slow nod. "He saw me, and he knew I saw him. Didn't say a word, just turned and walked back inside, like it never happened." "Did you tell the inspector?" Grayson shrugged. "Inspector Cade's got enough noise in his ears. If the judge wants to say he never left, that's his problem." Eleanor smiled faintly. It might be a bigger problem than he realizes. She thanked Grayson, and made her way down the hall, where a young woman sat at a desk, fingers tapping absent-mindedly against a stack of transcripts. A court typist, sharp-eyed, with the look of someone who noticed everything. Eleanor stopped beside her. "You were working outside the courtroom this morning." The typist glanced up, expression carefully neutral. "That's right." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "And you saw the judge?" A pause, a flicker of hesitation. "I did." And just like that, the thread tightened. The courtroom was too still, as if the very walls held their breath, waiting for something to crack. Eleanor Caldwell listened, absorbing every hesitant pause, every too carefully chosen word. The typist glanced up, her fingers resting against a stack of unfinished transcripts. "Not exactly," she murmured, when asked if she'd seen the judge in court. Eleanor waited, and the woman sighed. "I saw him step into the hall, just for a moment, looked around, then went back in." "Before or after the murder?" "Before." That single word sent a fresh ripple through Eleanor's mind. Hoft had been seen outside the judge's chambers, lingering like a man caught in indecision. Judge Redgrave, supposedly on the bench the entire time, had been seen slipping away. Two stories, both quietly unraveling the official account. The facts were shifting, and when facts shifted, it meant someone was lying. Eleanor intended to find out who. She left the courthouse, letting the weight of the puzzle settle in her mind. Outside, the late afternoon stretched thin, the air carrying the crisp bite of an approaching storm. It led her to the warm book-lined haven of Mrs. Brent's cottage, where the fire crackled in the grate, the scent of tea and aged paper filling the air. It was the sort of place where one might imagine the world to be neat, predictable, but Eleanor knew better. She sat at a small writing desk, a cup of tea untouched beside her, and spread out a fresh sheet of paper. The key to unraveling any tangled thread was seeing the strands clearly. At the top, She wrote the last confirmed sighting of Albert Blackwell, alive. From there, she mapped the movements of every significant player. Judge Redgrave had an alibi, but Carter the bailiff had seen him leave. The typist had confirmed it. Hoft had claimed illness, yet he was loitering near the judge's chambers, a headache or something heavier pressing against his conscience. Drummond had stayed put in the courtroom, guilty of many things perhaps, but not this. Harriet Longford had secrets of her own, but no obvious motive to kill Blackwell. Eleanor tapped her pencil against the paper, eyes narrowing. 2 men, Redgrave and Hoft, both behaving like they were waiting for something to detonate. And then there was the matter of the poison. Night bloom. Rare, intentional. Not something one stumbled upon. Whoever had used it had planned this for longer than today. A locked room, a staged scene, a missing ledger that no one had seen, yet everyone feared. Somewhere in the cracks of this carefully orchestrated performance, the murderer had made a mistake, and mistakes led to answers. The courthouse was quieter than before, tension thick as Eleanor stepped inside Judge Redgrave's office. Across from her, he sat, back stiff, expression carefully neutral. "I assume this is necessary," he said, his irritation barely masked. Eleanor smiled politely. "I wouldn't trouble you otherwise." Redgrave sighed. "Very well, the chambers are at your disposal, though I fail to see the point." "Oh, I believe we'll all see the point soon enough," she murmured. She turned toward Inspector Hayes, who had been leaning against the far wall, watching with the patience of a man who had seen too much. "You've gathered the others?" she asked. He straightened. "They're waiting." Minutes later, the group stood outside the judge's private chambers, Hoft arms crossed, his jaw set tight. Harriet Longford, poised but with an edge of stillness that spoke of tension just below the surface. Drummond, standing slightly apart, the air of a man bracing for an accusation, and Redgrave himself, lingering by the door, his impatience giving way to something colder. "Well?" Redgrave asked, his voice clipped. "What exactly do you intend to prove?" Eleanor adjusted her gloves, stepping inside the dim chamber. "That this was never just a murder," she said. "It was a performance." The room loomed around them, dark wood paneling, towering bookshelves, the judge's desk still disturbingly pristine, as though untouched by the crime. The chair where Blackwell had slumped remained precisely where it had been, waiting for its next unfortunate occupant. Eleanor's gaze swept the space, settling on the empty glass beside the desk, a single anomaly in an otherwise curated stage. Her voice was soft, but unyielding. "Albert Blackwell was found here, poisoned. The door was locked from the inside. The glass of water beside him, the only thing out of place." She turned, taking in the faces before her. Somewhere among them, the truth waited to be revealed. The air inside the judge's chambers was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Eleanor Caldwell stood at the center of it all, the delicate fingers of her gloved hand trailing along the polished edge of the desk, where Samuel Arkwright had died. "We now know 2 things," she said, her voice calm, cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "First, Judge Latham stepped out of the courtroom, despite his earlier claim that he had not. Second, Mr. Henshaw was seen hesitating outside these very chambers, just before the body was discovered." The prosecutor stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I already told you, I wasn't feeling well," he said, but the words rang hollow. Eleanor offered a small nod, her expression unreadable. "Yes, it does seem to be an unfortunate day for headaches." From the far end of the room, Marianne Whitmore let out a sharp breath, somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "So what are you saying, Miss Caldwell, that one of these men poisoned Arkwright?" Eleanor's lips curved slightly, but the smile never reached her eyes. "No, Miss Whitmore, I'm saying one of them knew exactly what was about to happen." She turned toward the desk, resting a gloved fingertip against the rim of an empty glass. "And the only question left is whether they planned it or panicked." A tense silence followed, thick as fog. Then Detective Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "Well," he muttered, eyeing the gathered faces, "this ought to be good." Eleanor moved with quiet precision, resetting the scene like a playwright arranging the final act. The desk, the chair, the half-drunk glass of water, carefully placed where it had been found beside Arkwright's stiffening hand. The others watched her in silence. Inspector Graves stood by the door, arms crossed. Whitmore leaned against the bookshelves, her sharp gaze unreadable. Henry Driscoll, the solicitor, shifted from foot to foot, as though he couldn't decide whether to sit or run. Henshaw and Judge Latham stood apart, both too still, their eyes fixed on her, but for very different reasons. Eleanor reached into her handbag and withdrew a silk handkerchief, its embroidered initials glinting under the lamplight. She let it rest against the chair's arm. "A planted piece of evidence," she murmured, "stitched hastily enough that a careful eye could undo the lie." Her gaze landed on Driscoll, whose wide eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Someone wanted you to take the fall, Mr. Driscoll." The solicitor swallowed hard, but said nothing. She moved next to the desk, lifting a small vial between two fingers. "And this," she continued, her voice even, "nightshade extract, rare, effective, and according to Dr. Holloway, precisely what was used to kill Arkwright." Judge Latham exhaled sharply. "I don't keep nightshade in my chambers." Eleanor tilted her head ever so slightly. "That's an interesting thing to say, Your Honor, considering no one has accused you of it yet." His jaw tightened. "You think I had something to do with this?" Eleanor set the vial back down. "I think," she said, "that you and Mr. Henshaw have been lying since this morning." Henshaw twitched, his fingers moving toward his collar. "That's ridiculous," he muttered. "Is it?" Eleanor gestured toward the desk. "Because if this vial were truly left as a clumsy attempt to frame Judge Latham, I would expect there to be no connection to this office." She lifted a second item, an ink bottle with a dried ring around its edge. "But this, you see, tells a different story." Graves took a step forward, frowning. "Explain." Eleanor dabbed a fingertip against the rim of the bottle, then held it up. A faint stain, brownish, slightly discolored. "This ink," she said, "was contaminated." Judge Latham's mouth opened, then closed. Arkwright was a man who handled documents daily. He wrote letters, signed agreements. If someone wanted to poison him without raising suspicion, there was no need to slip it into his drink. Her gaze swept over the room. All they needed was for him to touch the ink, to rub his fingers against his lips, absent-mindedly. The silence was deafening. Henshaw ran a hand through his hair, sweat beading at his temples. "You look unwell, Mr. Henshaw," Eleanor noted. His lips parted, but no words came. She picked up the handkerchief again, studying it as though seeing it for the first time. A hastily stitched piece of evidence, left behind to mislead the investigation. A vial that appeared in a desk drawer, as if by magic, and an ink bottle that should have contained nothing but ink. She turned back to the assembled faces. "I think it's time we stop pretending this was an accident." No one moved. The trap had been set. Now it was only a matter of seeing who fell into it first. The courtroom held its breath, though the air itself seemed thick with something unseen, tension, dread, the weight of a truth no one wished to name. Eleanor Caldwell stood at the center of it all, her hands resting lightly on the defense table, a composed figure against the storm of uncertainty that had settled over the room. "Let us consider the facts," she said, her voice even deliberate, slicing through the silence like a scalpel. First, the glass, placed in his hands, offered as an innocent courtesy. He took the drink and moments later collapsed. But poison, particularly something as rare as nightshade extract, isn't used on impulse. It requires planning. And whoever killed Warren Ellsworth had plenty of time to plan. A sharp intake of breath, followed by the smooth, calculated voice of Victor Henshaw, the prosecutor. And yet all the evidence still points to Mr. Ashford. Eleanor turned to him, her gaze patient, unwavering. Does it? Henshaw folded his arms, his expression steeled. He was being blackmailed, his career hanging by a thread, and then by sheer coincidence, the one man who could ruin him drops dead. He scoffed. Too convenient. Too easy. Eleanor corrected, her tone almost casual. Henshaw's eyes narrowed. And what exactly does that mean? Eleanor adjusted the silk handkerchief in her palm, the embroidered initials still visible despite the broken stitching. It means that whoever planted this was counting on us to follow the breadcrumbs. It means that Arthur Ashford was the perfect person to blame. A slow exhale from across the room. Ashford, still pale from the long hours of questioning, looked as though he might collapse from sheer exhaustion. So you believe me? He asked, his voice hoarse. Eleanor gave him a brief, unreadable glance. I believe you weren't clever enough to orchestrate this, she said simply. He blinked, caught between offense and gratitude. She turned back to the gathered figures. Now about the door, she continued. Everyone has been quite fascinated by the fact that it was locked from the inside, as if that somehow made this an impossible crime. She moved toward the heavy oak door, running her fingers along the latch before allowing a small knowing smile to touch her lips. But there's nothing difficult about it, she said, turning to face them once more. A piece of string looped around the lock, threaded through the keyhole, pulled tight from the outside. A simple trick, executed in mere seconds. Henshaw scoffed. That's absurd. Someone would have seen it. Eleanor's gaze remained steady. Not if they were careful, she countered. Not if they waited for just the right moment, when the hallway was empty, when people were too distracted to notice. A pause, letting the weight of her words settle, and certainly not if they were someone everyone trusted. That was when it happened, the smallest, almost imperceptible shift. Harriet Alcott's gaze flicked, quick as a blade, to the side, calculating. Ashford swallowed hard. Judge Latham pressed his lips into a thin line, as though forcing himself to remain expressionless. And Henshaw didn't move at all. Eleanor folded the handkerchief neatly between her fingers. I do believe we're very close. Inspector Graves, standing near the judge's bench, let out a slow breath through his nose. Then let's finish it, he said. The room held its breath. Eleanor's gaze swept over the faces before her. She already knew the answer. Now she simply had to make them see it. The courthouse carried a different kind of weight after hours. The echoes of footsteps stretched longer. The air felt thick with the scent of aged paper and whispered secrets. The walls, lined with history, seemed to lean in, bearing silent witness to what was about to unfold. By the time the clock above the judge's bench struck 8, the room was full, not with a jury, not with spectators, but with something heavier. Eleanor had made certain of that. She sat at the defense table, hands folded neatly in front of her, watching as the room settled. It took time. People did not like waiting for bad news. Inspector Graves stood near the bench, arms crossed, his very presence enough to keep anyone from attempting to slip away. Judge Latham took his seat as if he still held the authority that had long since been shaken. Henshaw, the prosecutor, leaned against the railing, his grip tightening around his wrist. Harriet Alcott perched at the edge of a chair, legs crossed, chin lifted, too composed, too still. Arthur Ashford sat apart from them all. He looked worse than he had earlier, but at least for the first time he did not look like a man awaiting his own execution. Soft murmurs hovered in the air, uncertain. They died the moment Eleanor rose to her feet. She moved to the center of the room, her steps unhurried, every movement deliberate, measured. She had played her role carefully. Quiet observation, polite questions, a nod here, a knowing glance there. Now, it was time for something else. She turned to face them, the weight of the moment pressing against her shoulders, but not bending them. Warren Ellsworth is dead, she said, her voice even, steady, and not a single one of you looks surprised. Silence. She took a step forward. He was a blackmailer, she continued. A man who spent his life prying into the private matters of others, turning their mistakes into his own personal fortune. He knew things no one should have known, and that knowledge made him powerful. Her gaze swept over them, her words deliberate, sharp. It also made him a target. Judge Latham's expression darkened. If you've gathered us here for a morality lecture, Miss Caldwell. Eleanor lifted a gloved hand, silencing him. Oh, not at all, Your Honor, she said, adjusting her cuffs with calm precision. I simply thought it was time we stopped pretending. A pause. The trap had been set. Now all that remained was to watch who fell into it first. Dim candlelight flickered against the polished oak of the study, shadows stretching long across the walls as the heavy grandfather clock chimed once, twice, an ominous echo against the silence. Inspector Graves surveyed the gathered figures, his gaze sharp beneath the brim of his hat, his fingers tapping idly against the arm of the chair. Eleanor Vance sat poised at the edge of the chaise, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression betraying nothing. Across from her, Lawrence Whitmore clutched his brandy glass with the grip of a drowning man, his knuckles white against the cut crystal. Dr. Samuel Kincaid stood rigid near the fireplace, his normally unshakable composure faltering ever so slightly. And at the far end of the room, leaning against the desk where Edmund Sterling had drawn his last breath, was Veronica Hale, the widow, cold-eyed, unreadable. Let's not pretend, Graves finally spoke, his voice slicing through the thick tension. We all know Sterling had more enemies than friends, but murder requires intent, calculation. It requires an understanding of time, of opportunity, and most of all, it requires a hand willing to strike the final blow. His eyes swept the room, watching the minute reactions, a twitch of a mouth, a fleeting glance. Aconite, he continued, drawing a small glass vial from his pocket and setting it on the desk with a deliberate clink. Commonly known as monkshood. In small doses, it causes weakness, numbness. In large doses, a most excruciating death. And yet it was not found in Sterling's drink, nor in his food. No, it was here. He reached for the leather-bound ledger that sat open on the desk, its pages meticulously scrawled with Sterling's meticulous records. Ink, Graves said simply. A slow poison, absorbed through the skin, lingering in his system over days. An execution, not a crime of passion. A beat of silence. Then Lawrence exhaled sharply, shaking his head. That's impossible, is it? Graves turned to him. You were his business partner, were you not? The one who stood to inherit the majority of his shares. Lawrence stiffened. That's preposterous. Graves merely lifted the ledger. Strange, then, that his most recent entries suggested a plan to remove you from the company altogether. The words landed like a blow, and Lawrence's face drained of color. But, Graves continued, turning to the widow now, we mustn't forget the grieving wife, must we, Mrs. Hale? A husband whose affairs, if exposed, would have left you with nothing. A man who had secrets, ones you were desperate to bury. Veronica's lips parted, but no words came. And Dr. Kincaid, Graves went on, pivoting smoothly, a trusted friend, but also the only one in this room with the expertise to procure and administer such a poison without immediate suspicion. The doctor's jaw clenched. The tension grew, thick as fog. So tell me, Graves murmured, stepping back, watching their expressions shift under the weight of his words, which of you was desperate enough to kill? A gust of wind rattled the windows, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil within, and in the silence that followed, Eleanor Vance finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Perhaps, Inspector, you already know the answer. The room was thick with silence, the kind that clung to the air like fog before a storm. Inspector Alden stepped forward, his boots echoing against the marble floor of Blackwood Hall's grand study. The scent of old books and faint cigar smoke lingered, mixing with something else, something acrid, something wrong. Across from him, Eleanor Blackwood sat rigid in the high-backed chair, her fingers wrapped too tightly around the armrests. Beside her, Simon Graves shifted uneasily, his usual smirk absent. Then there was Charles Whitlow, the solicitor, standing by the liquor cabinet, though he hadn't poured himself a drink, and at the desk, hands folded neatly, expression unreadable, sat Victor Langley, the late Lord Blackwood's closest confidant. "You did what you had to do," Alden said quietly, his gaze resting on Eleanor, ensured that when he reached for his water, it was the last thing he ever drank. Her breath hitched, so faint it might have gone unnoticed, but Alden caught it. Across the room, Langley exhaled sharply. "This is absurd," he said, his voice too even. "You have no proof." Alden only smiled, slow and deliberate. "You already gave it to me." A tense silence stretched between them. Then Simon let out a bitter chuckle. "Well damn," he ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "Guess the game's over." But Alden wasn't looking at Simon, his eyes remained on Eleanor, watching as she fought to keep her composure. Lord Blackwood had enemies, he continued. He thrived on secrets, wielded them like knives, but secrets are only useful if the holder is alive. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. Someone wanted him silent, someone who knew exactly how he'd die before he did. Eleanor's knuckles turned white against the chair. "Poison," Alden said. "Belladonna. Tasteless, quick in the right dosage, and conveniently kept among the medicinal herbs in the estate's greenhouse." Whitlow cleared his throat. "A tragic accident, surely." "Hardly," Alden countered. "Not when the glass was wiped clean, not when the gardener recalls a sudden interest in the nightshade plants, not when Lord Blackwood's will was set to change the very next morning." Another breathless pause. Then Langley's mask cracked, just slightly. "You're bluffing." Alden reached into his coat, pulling out a folded piece of parchment. "Am I? Because I have here a copy of the preliminary changes to his will, ones that never came to pass. And guess whose name suddenly appeared as primary beneficiary?" He unfolded the document with a flick, eyes locking onto Eleanor's. "You," she inhaled sharply. Graves cursed under his breath. Whitlow rubbed his temple, exasperated. "Christ, Eleanor," he muttered. Eleanor's lips parted, but she found no words. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Alden spoke again, softer this time, almost pitying. "Desperation makes murderers of us all." The study doors opened. 2 constables stepped inside. "Miss Blackwood," Alden said, stepping back, "I believe you should come with us." She hesitated, just for a moment, then exhaled, her shoulders sagging. She had played the game well, but Alden had played it better. As she was led away, Simon let out a low whistle. That was dramatic. Alden smirked, tucking the parchment away. These things often are. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows over Blackwood Hall. The scandal would settle, the world would move on, but some stains never washed away. The rain had begun just after midnight, a steady, insistent drizzle that painted the cobbled streets in a dull sheen and made the gaslights flicker like dying stars. Inside the dim confines of Blackwell's study, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, ink, and something sharper, unspoken words, unburied ghosts. Inspector Alden stood by the fireplace, fingers drumming absently against the edge of a case file, his gaze steady on the man slumped in the armchair across from him. Charles Redgrave, once a man of power, now a man of ruin, stared into the middle distance, the weight of survival pressing his shoulders inward. "Well," Alden said at last, flipping the file shut with a quiet snap, "it seems you've escaped the gallows, Mr. Redgrave." The words hung between them, heavy as iron. Redgrave exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "You'll forgive me if I don't feel particularly relieved." From the far end of the room, Elizabeth Holloway, solicitor and quiet observer, let out a soft chuckle, the sound brittle. "No murder charge," she mused, adjusting the cuffs of her coat, "but the fraud investigation remains, and last I checked, The courts have little patience for men who cook their ledgers. Alden's lips twitched. No noose perhaps, but a prison cell all the same. Redgrave's mouth twisted. A small price, wouldn't you say? Elizabeth sipped from the tea she had poured, but hadn't truly intended to drink. That depends entirely on perspective. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming against the study windows in restless fingers. Then from the doorway, Thomas Ashford cleared his throat. There was something different about him now. Gone was the perpetual arrogance, the untouchable confidence. He had seen something, learned something, that had left a mark. Blackwell, he said at last, voice low, was a monster. His hands curled into fists, and monsters deserve what they get. Alden tilted his head slightly, studying him. Perhaps, he allowed, but justice and retribution rarely walk the same road. Ashford held his gaze, something unreadable flickering in his eyes, then scoffed. You expect gratitude? Oh no, Alden murmured, setting his file down. You'll have quite enough of that from others. Ashford's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing more. With a stiff nod, he turned on his heel, and disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps swallowed by the storm outside. Redgrave let out a breath. What was that about? Alden didn't answer. He already knew the truth. Men like Ashford did not simply walk away from ruin. No, they carried it with them, let it settle into their bones. Across from him, Elizabeth Holloway sighed, setting her teacup down with a soft clink. Still thinking about it. Alden's gaze lingered on the rain-blurred glass. Secrets, he murmured, have a way of staying alive long after the man who held them is gone. Elizabeth exhaled, thoughtful. You mean Blackwell's ledgers? If they ever existed, Alden replied. Or if someone made damn sure they wouldn't be found. Elizabeth's fingers traced the rim of her cup. Fear, she said, makes people do terrible things. Alden nodded, his voice almost lost beneath the storm. People aren't born murderers, they become them. The last traces of rain had dried, but the scent of damp earth still clung to the quiet streets of Ashcombe. A village accustomed to secrets knew how to bury them swiftly, yet some had a way of resisting the soil, of lingering like ghosts in the corners of parlors, in the whispers exchanged beneath the gaslight glow of the town square. Miss Evelyn Harrow stood at the station, her gloved fingers wrapped firmly around the handle of her modest leather suitcase, her expression composed yet distant. The air was crisp with the promise of departure, of something ending, though she knew better than most. Some things never truly ended. Across the way, the courthouse loomed in the pale morning light, its stone facade as impassive as ever. Behind those walls decisions had been made, justice had been declared, at least in the way justice was often served, not as a clean slate, but as a ledger carefully balanced, where debts of silence had been paid in full. The name Blackwood would not be spoken so freely now, not in polite company, though the shadow he had cast over Ashcombe would not be so easily erased. The town would move on, as towns always did, but Miss Harrow knew that some stains never truly faded, they simply became part of the fabric, woven so tightly into the pattern, that they could no longer be undone. A rustle of movement drew her gaze. Inspector Grove stood near the square, fastening the buttons of his coat, with practiced ears, though his eyes flickered toward her just once before turning away. There were things left unsaid between them, truths exchanged in glances rather than words. He had his law, she had her methods. And though they had walked different paths, they had arrived at the same conclusion, each bearing the weight of it in their own way. He had no farewell to give, nor did she expect one. Some understandings did not require speech. From the gate of her lodgings, Mrs. Winthrop lingered, her usual stiff posture slightly softened. The sharp-eyed landlady, who had so often watched Evelyn with suspicion, now regarded her with something else, reluctance, perhaps even something close to respect. You could stay, you know, she murmured at last, her voice stripped of its habitual briskness. Evelyn met her gaze with a knowing smile. That would rather defeat the purpose. wouldn't it? Mrs. Winthrop exhaled, nodding though she did not look satisfied with the answer. Some places, some people, were meant only to be passing chapters, and Ashcombe, its hushed streets, its wary eyes, its long-held secrets was one of them. The train's distant whistle curled through the air, and moments later, the engine rumbled into view, trailing thick plumes of smoke. Evelyn lifted her case and stepped forward, boarding with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to leaving. Inside, the compartment was hushed. Across from her, a gentleman turned the pages of his newspaper with mechanical precision. A woman adjusted the lace of her gloves, her gaze flickering briefly to Evelyn's before darting away. The world moved on, unaware, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the ghosts that still lingered in the spaces between moments. Settling into her seat, Evelyn reached into her coat pocket. The slip of paper was still there, folded neatly, the ink crisp. A name, a place, a reminder that endings were never quite as final as they seemed. She unfolded it just long enough to glance at the words once more, before tucking it away, securing it like a secret, meant for another time. The train lurched forward, steel wheels grinding against the rails, pulling her away from Ashcombe, and towards something new. Another village, another case, another mystery waiting in the shadows. She took a slow breath, and turned her gaze toward the passing countryside, where fields blurred into gold and green, the horizon stretching endlessly before her. And as always, Evelyn Harrow would be ready,